I thought I was just her TA, until she whispered, "My real lesson starts after class." The first day as her TA felt like stepping into a world that was both familiar and quietly magnetic. The lecture hall smelled faintly of chalk and old books, a scent I had grown accustomed to during my years as a student, yet now it carried a new weight. She moved across the stage with a grace that seemed effortless, but there was a subtle authority in the way she paused mid-sentence, letting the words hang just long enough for everyone to lean in. I couldn't help noticing the way her hand brushed against the stack of papers on the podium, the faint gleam of her watch catching the fluorescent lights. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic, not because she was trying to be, but simply because she existed in that space so completely. From my spot near the back, I observed her with a mixture of professional curiosity and personal intrigue. Her voice was calm, measured, but carried a warmth that made the lecture feel intimate rather than formal. When she glanced in my direction, briefly, almost accidentally, her eyes lingered just a second too long to be purely casual. It was enough to make my chest tighten, an odd combination of excitement and caution. She wasn't overtly flirtatious, but there was a subtle pull in her presence that demanded attention, a quiet gravity I hadn't expected to feel toward a professor. Grading papers during the first office hours was when the tension became tangible. Our hands occasionally brushed as we reached for the same essay, and each time, I felt a jolt, a warmth that traveled along my arm and left a lingering awareness in its wake. She would pause to adjust her glasses or tilt her head thoughtfully, and in those quiet moments, there was a softness in her gaze that contrasted beautifully with her confident, authoritative exterior. She asked questions about my insights on student work, and in the way she listened, really listened, I sensed she valued more than just my academic judgment. There was a curiosity in her eyes, a subtle invitation to connect on more than a purely professional level. Despite the professional setting, there were moments that made it impossible to ignore the tension building between us. The gentle touch on my shoulder when guiding me through classroom technology, the way she would hand me papers so close that our fingers brushed, the quiet acknowledgement of my presence in small, meaningful ways, it all felt like a delicate dance of boundaries and unspoken attraction. I found myself walking the line between admiration and distraction, drawn to her warmth, the elegance of her movements, and the thoughtful cadence of her voice. Every detail, the faint scent of her perfume, the soft rustle of her scarf, the way light caught in her hair, seemed amplified in my awareness. It wasn't just attraction, it was the beginning of fascination, a slow, simmering pull that promised more than I could yet name. By the end of that first day, I realized that being her TA wasn't just about grading papers or assisting with lectures. Something unspoken hung in the air, an uncharted tension that suggested her lessons extended beyond the classroom. And even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real story, the one that would challenge, intrigue, and perhaps change me, was only just beginning. The first few times I stayed after class, it was purely practical, organizing papers, answering her questions about the lecture slides, or helping with the projector when it stubbornly refused to cooperate. But gradually, the ordinary tasks began to carry a weight I hadn't anticipated. She lingered just a little longer than necessary, sorting her notes while casting quick, observant glances my way. It wasn't overt, not the kind of attention that demanded recognition, but subtle enough to make my pulse quicken without me realizing it until my hands trembled slightly while stacking a pile of essays. One afternoon, as the last student left and the hall emptied, she asked me to help carry a stack of graded assignments to her office. The fluorescent lights flickered softly overhead, and the quiet of the room felt intimate, almost like the world had shrunk around the two of us. When our hands met on the corner of a folder, the contact lingered longer than necessary. A warmth traveled from my fingertips up my arm, and I found myself acutely aware of how close she stood. Her presence was magnetic, comforting yet electrifying. She smiled, just the slightest curve of her lips, and the sound of her voice when she spoke, soft, teasing, precise, lingered in the air long after the words had passed. There were moments when the professional boundaries blurred, not through anything overt, but through the small, careful gestures she allowed. A hand resting briefly on my shoulder as she leaned to point at a grading note. A tilt of her head that brought her hair nearly brushing my cheek as she examined a diagram I had prepared. Each gesture was fleeting, polite, yet it carried an almost imperceptible intimacy. It wasn't about seduction, it was about presence, awareness, connection. Each encounter left a trace, a residue of tension and curiosity I couldn't shake. I began noticing things beyond her professional poise, the faint scent of her perfume, the subtle shift in tone when she asked a question just to hear my thoughts, the way her eyes softened for a fraction of a second when she paused mid-sentence. She shared small personal details, an anecdote about a childhood friend, a fleeting comment about the challenges of grading stacks of papers, and in those moments, the classroom facade melted slightly. The connection felt fragile, like a secret suspended in the air between us, a tension that was thrilling precisely because it was unspoken. At the same time, there was a constant inner conflict. Professional decorum pulled me back every time my attention drifted, reminding me to maintain boundaries, yet the draw of these after-class encounters was undeniable. Each lingering glance, each fleeting touch, seemed to hint that the lessons weren't just academic. I was learning something beyond formulas, essays, and deadlines, something intimate, nuanced, and profoundly human. By the end of the week, it became clear that the after-class moments were the ones I looked forward to most. There was a rhythm to them, a subtle push and pull of curiosity and restraint. The ordinary hallways, the quiet offices, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, all became charged spaces, laden with the possibility of connection. And as she straightened a pile of papers and gave me a fleeting, knowing smile, I realized that these encounters weren't just convenient, they were lessons in patience, observation, and something deeper that neither of us was ready to name aloud. It started with small confessions, passing comments about life outside the classroom, fleeting insights into her world, and the occasional smile that seemed to carry more than simple friendliness. Those moments were rare, almost accidental, yet they slowly peeled away the polished exterior she maintained in front of students. One afternoon, as I lingered in her office helping sort a particularly messy stack of student papers, she sighed and leaned back in her chair, fingers lightly drumming the desktop. Her expression was soft, almost vulnerable, a rare glimpse of the person behind the professor. I felt the instinctive urge to look away, to maintain the professional distance, but something in her tone invited attention, a subtle plea for recognition that went beyond the academic. We began sharing pieces of ourselves in fragments. I spoke about my ambitions, the uncertainty of early career choices, and the quiet anxieties that often followed me through long study sessions. She listened with an intensity that felt rare, eyes fixed on mine, a tilt of her head that suggested more than politeness. When she shared her own moments of doubt or tired frustration, it was never dramatic or self-pitying, it was measured, honest, and somehow profoundly human. A fleeting pause, a sigh, the brush of her hand against her notes, these small gestures spoke louder than words. For a brief moment, it felt as if the weight of our professional roles softened, leaving a space where we could simply be two people, navigating the same uncertainties. Physical proximity became an unspoken language. When she explained the grading rubric, our shoulders brushed lightly, a stray strand of her hair fell across her cheek, and without thinking, I reached to tuck it back behind her ear. The contact was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but the warmth lingered long after. Each gesture, each shared laugh over a student's peculiar comment or a misprinted assignment, deepened the quiet intimacy between us. These were the kinds of moments that couldn't be labeled, moments that hovered delicately on the edge of something more, yet remained grounded in genuine connection. There was also an underlying tension, the awareness of how unusual it was for a student and a professor to share such moments of vulnerability. I found myself acutely conscious of the age difference, the expectations of propriety, and the whispers of societal perception. Yet, the pull of this connection, the softness in her eyes, the slight brush of her hand, the warmth of her presence, made restraint difficult. It was a delicate balance between curiosity and caution, desire and respect, fascination and propriety. By the end of the afternoon, as she thanked me quietly for helping organize the papers, there was a pause, a silence filled with meaning. The way her gaze met mine lingered just a beat too long, a shared acknowledgement of the unspoken bond forming. It wasn't romance yet, it was recognition, attention, and trust. In that moment, I realized the lessons she promised, after class, weren't about textbooks or grades, they were about seeing, understanding, and connecting. And while the boundaries of our professional roles remained, the quiet vulnerability we shared hinted at something far deeper, a connection that neither of us could ignore, no matter how cautiously we tread. The first time she mentioned that her real lesson began after class, it felt like a whisper that lingered in the quiet corners of my mind. At first, I tried to dismiss it, an offhand remark, perhaps, meant to tease or challenge, but the way she said it, with a half-smile and a subtle tilt of her head, carried weight. There was an intensity in her gaze, steady and deliberate, that made my chest tighten. It was as if she were opening a door just wide enough for me to peek inside, hinting at lessons that went far beyond textbooks and lecture slides. That afternoon, she asked me to stay behind under the pretense of discussing a grading discrepancy. The classroom had emptied, leaving the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the faint echo of departing footsteps. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of her perfume, and the space between us felt charged with a quiet anticipation. She leaned over the desk, not in a commanding way, but close enough that the heat of her presence brushed against me. Her hand hovered near mine as she sorted papers, and the tiniest contact, our fingers grazing, sent a jolt through me that I wasn't prepared to handle. Our conversation began with mundane academic details, but it didn't stay there. Her questions, casual yet pointed, seemed to probe more than just the correctness of an answer. There was curiosity in her tone, an unspoken invitation for me to think aloud, to share more than I normally would. As I spoke, I became aware of her listening, not just hearing, but absorbing every nuance of my words, the pauses, the hesitations, the subtle expressions of doubt or certainty. It was almost unsettling how present she was, and yet it drew me in, creating a closeness that was both thrilling and terrifying. The tension between professional propriety and personal connection was palpable. Every movement, her leaning closer to point at a note, the brush of her hair from her cheek, the slight shift in her chair, was charged with meaning. Yet she never crossed boundaries, every gesture was deliberate, respectful, and intimate without being improper. It was a careful dance, a lesson in presence and awareness, and I felt both captivated and cautious, acutely aware of the invisible lines we were navigating. At one point, she paused mid-sentence, and for a moment, the room seemed to shrink around us. Our eyes met, steady and searching, and I felt a quiet pull, a magnetic connection that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with understanding, attention, and unspoken acknowledgement. It was a lesson in subtlety, in noticing the nuances of human interaction, and in recognizing the emotional layers beneath the surface of casual gestures. By the time I left that day, I was exhausted in the best possible way. My mind replayed every detail, the brush of her hand, the warmth of her presence, the intensity in her eyes. I realized that the lessons she hinted at, after class, weren't just about academic growth, they were about emotional awareness, trust, and the fragile, intricate dance of connection. And while the boundaries of our roles remained, I knew that something deeper had begun, something that would challenge and change me in ways I could not yet fully comprehend. The quiet moments between us became the ones I cherished most. They weren't marked by grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but by the small, seemingly ordinary exchanges that carried an extraordinary weight. One evening, after the last lecture had ended and the hallways had emptied, we walked together to the faculty lounge to grab coffee. The soft click of our shoes against the polished floor echoed faintly, a rhythm that seemed to mirror the slow, deliberate pace of my thoughts. I noticed the gentle sway of her scarf as she moved, the subtle tilt of her head when she laughed at something I said, and the warmth in her eyes that lingered a beat longer than necessary. As we sat across from each other, the light from the low-hanging lamp casting soft shadows on her face, I felt an unusual closeness. Her hand brushed against mine as she reached for the sugar, and it wasn't a fleeting touch of coincidence, it was deliberate enough to leave a warm echo along my skin. Every gesture, every glance, carried an unspoken message of attention and trust. When she laughed softly at an offhand comment, the sound wrapped around me like a gentle current, pulling me further into the quiet intimacy of the moment. We began sharing stories, not heavy confessions, but glimpses into our worlds outside the classroom. I spoke about the little rituals that kept me grounded, the early mornings and late nights, and the ambitions that sometimes felt too big for my small apartment and budget. She listened, her eyes steady, her attention unwavering. And then she shared small fragments of her own life, the strains of balancing work with personal expectations, the quiet moments of doubt she rarely admitted aloud. These exchanges, soft and unhurried, created a bridge between us, a shared vulnerability that felt both exhilarating and comforting. Physical proximity became a subtle language of its own. At one point, when she leaned forward to examine a page of notes, her shoulder brushed mine. The warmth lingered, and I realized I wasn't merely aware of it, I was attuned to it, noting the way her presence seemed to fill the space without demanding it. Later, as we walked back to her office, she gently guided me around a puddle on the walkway, her hand resting briefly at my back. The contact was fleeting, unspoken, yet it left a quiet imprint, a sense of closeness that neither words nor gestures could fully capture. There was also an emotional rhythm to these encounters. We learned to read each other's pauses, the subtle shifts in tone, the glances that carried meaning without articulation. There was no rush, no overt romantic pursuit, only the slow, deliberate unfolding of trust, attention, and emotional awareness. The quiet tension simmered beneath the surface, a delicate interplay between restraint and connection that made each moment feel precious. By the end of the evening, I realized that these quiet interactions were becoming the highlight of my days. The laughter, the subtle touches, the shared confidences, they all wove together into a tapestry of intimacy that was as comforting as it was intoxicating. The lessons she had hinted at after class were no longer abstract, I was living them in these small, charged moments. And with each encounter, I felt the slow, undeniable pull of something deeper, something that went beyond the roles of professor and TA, something that was quietly, powerfully human. The confession didn't come in words at first. It came in the way she paused mid-sentence, eyes searching mine as if measuring something too delicate to speak aloud. That afternoon, the office was quiet, the muted hum of the fluorescent lights filling the space between us. Papers lay scattered across the desk, but they were incidental, neither of us truly focused on grading. There was a tension that hung in the air, palpable and unspoken, like the pause before a storm breaks. I found myself speaking first, hesitating, feeling my own voice tremble with an unfamiliar vulnerability. I admitted small truths, the way I'd looked forward to our after-class conversations, the comfort I found in her attention, and the odd mixture of admiration and longing that had crept into my daily thoughts. I expected surprise, perhaps disapproval, but instead, she simply listened. Her eyes softened, and she tilted her head slightly, as if every word I spoke was a gift to be treasured rather than judged. Then it was her turn. Her confession was quieter, more deliberate, wrapped in pauses and subtle gestures. She spoke of the isolation that sometimes came with her position, the weight of expectations, and the rare relief of finding someone who noticed the details, not just the work she produced, but the person she was behind the academic exterior. I watched her hands as she spoke, the way her fingers traced the edge of a folder, restless yet controlled. Each motion was a mirror of the hesitancy in her voice, a delicate dance between openness and caution. Physical closeness became a language neither of us had needed to name. When she leaned forward to emphasize a point, her shoulder brushed mine. The contact was fleeting, yet it resonated deep within me, a warmth, a reminder of the trust and intensity simmering just beneath the surface. Later, as our conversation veered into more personal territory, she rested her hand briefly near mine on the desk, her fingers brushing against the back of my hand. It was enough to make my chest tighten, enough to remind me of the delicate balance we were maintaining. Hesitation lingered in every glance, every half-smile, every fleeting touch. Neither of us rushed the confession, because the unspoken rules, the age difference, the professional boundaries, the subtle fear of societal judgment, were always present. Yet those constraints only made each moment of honesty more precious, more potent. There was a thrilling ache in the restraint, a constant awareness of the tension that could easily tip if we were careless. By the end of that afternoon, there was no dramatic declaration, no abrupt crossing of lines, only quiet acknowledgement. We had shared truths, glimpses of ourselves that were usually hidden, and in doing so, deepened the connection between us. The confession had arrived, not in words alone, but in presence, attention, and the silent understanding that our bond had shifted irreversibly. I left the office with my heart racing, acutely aware of every detail, the brush of her hand, the softness of her gaze, the weight of her attention. It was a slow-burn intimacy, one built on vulnerability and hesitation, and I knew that the real lessons, the ones that mattered most, were just beginning to unfold. The final moments together felt different from anything that had come before. There was no urgency, no dramatic confession, only the quiet, steady warmth of mutual understanding. We were in her office once more, the sunlight filtering gently through the blinds, painting the room in soft, golden stripes. Papers were neatly stacked, the last grading tasks behind us, leaving only the presence of one another. The air seemed charged, not with tension, but with recognition, the acknowledgement that the slow, careful intimacy we had cultivated had reached a point of quiet fulfillment. She smiled, the kind of smile that spoke volumes without words. It was gentle, knowing, and full of warmth, the kind that made me feel both seen and appreciated. When she reached out to adjust a loose strand of hair near my temple, her fingers lingered just slightly longer than necessary, a tender, deliberate contact that carried more weight than any declaration. I felt a deep, steady warmth where her touch met mine, a sense of safety and closeness that had been building over countless after-class conversations, quiet walks, and shared confidences. We talked softly, not about grades or lessons, but about life, about the small joys and struggles that each of us navigated. Her voice was calm and even, but beneath it lay the same intensity that had drawn me in from the start. When our hands brushed as she reached for a pen, neither of us pulled away, an unspoken agreement that these touches were meaningful, yet respectful. Every glance, every smile, every subtle shift in posture spoke of a connection deeper than mere words could convey. At one point, she reached out and rested her hand gently on mine. The warmth of her palm, the subtle pressure, communicated trust, gratitude, and an affection that was entirely safe yet profoundly intimate. I felt my chest tighten, not from desire, but from the overwhelming sense of being fully present, fully acknowledged. It was a culmination of all the quiet, simmering tension, all the near-touching moments and lingering glances, all the small gestures that had slowly woven our lives together into something emotionally undeniable. There was laughter, too, soft, genuine, the kind that filled the room without needing a reason. It was a shared joy, a recognition of the comfort we had found in one another, and a celebration of the slow, careful way our bond had developed. The age difference, the professional roles, the societal expectations, all of it felt secondary to the simple truth that we had discovered a connection built on patience, attention, and respect. As I prepared to leave, she paused and looked at me with a quiet intensity. I saw in her eyes a reflection of my own feelings, a mixture of admiration, gratitude, and the gentle warmth of trust. We shared a final, lingering look, our fingers brushing briefly in a farewell that was both intimate and entirely appropriate. In that moment, I realized that the lessons she had promised, after class, were not about knowledge from textbooks, they were about seeing, understanding, and connecting with another person in a deeply human way. Walking out of the office, I carried with me a sense of completion and hope. The story had reached its emotional climax, but its impact lingered, a quiet resonance that would stay with me long after the classroom lights had dimmed. The slow burn romance had found its resolution, not in dramatic gestures, but in the small, meaningful touches, the shared vulnerabilities, and the profound intimacy of two people learning to truly see one another.